Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. My apologies for my lack of speaking in Turkish, but I've spent time in Turkey and love the country and know how much agriculture and food systems are core to the livelihood of the country. And what I'll be sharing about in this next presentation is about driving the transformation to climate smart agriculture. So what we are looking at is a scenario where there is a demand from consumers that we find is driven by health and well-being. Number one, consumers want access to high quality, nutritious, safe products that will not cause disease or cancer, other issues for foodborne illnesses. So we find that driving it on the consumer side is the health and wellness, and secondarily is the planetary and farmer and farm worker well-being. We find those to be secondary, and a smaller percentage who make their purchase decisions. As you go upstream, you have, let's say, the leading brands and retailers who are creating the products that are sold to the consumers. What's driving their incentives, their motivation to transition to climate smart food systems, climate smart agriculture? Number one, it's serving the demands of consumers who want to see greater purpose, greater transparency, greater sustainability from their brands and retailers. But even more so today, we're finding that the political and legal risk is a major driver for this transition to climate smart agriculture. And that includes litigation risk around misreporting of impacts. And so for many retailers and brands, 80 to 90% of their sustainability impacts are actually from their upstream suppliers. And for the vast majority of large retailers, large distributors, large brands, they don't actually know the impact information, and in many cases, the source of their supply chains and raw materials. And therefore, they're at risk to be selling products that have deforestation, child labor, other impacts that provide a legal risk when the corporations have to abide by laws of countries that are demanding accuracy in the reporting of these impacts, as well as scope 3, as we call it, which is the carbon and sustainability impacts upstream of their suppliers. The third area that is driving the retailers and the brands towards sustainable food systems is raw material shortages. So climate change, as you all are aware, is creating major impacts on water, on soil, on labor, on hurricanes and pests and disease. And so there's an increasing risk from not having access to raw materials. And when you look at geopolitical issues like we are all seeing with Ukraine, Russia, and other political issues globally, it's causing inflation of food prices due to the increased costs of fertilizers, the increased costs of oil, gas, and shipping and logistics. And so it's putting pressure as well on brands, retailers, and distributors to start considering a shift to climate smart agriculture, climate smart food systems that will use inputs, that will use other supplies that are going to de-risk the reliance on the global chemical trade, on global fossil fuels, on international shipping. And so we're seeing a unique moment where when you combine these factors of the consumer demand for purpose and sustainability and transparency from their brands, retailers, distributors, when you add in the importance of risk on litigation risk, And when you add in finally the raw material shortage list, in terms of not having access to lower cost raw materials, this is combining today to create a unique moment where the leading buyers of raw materials who process these materials to then sell to consumers, they are now looking for models where they can secure raw materials, where they can invest and engage directly with their suppliers so that they are able to secure raw materials now and into the future. So as we look to driving the transformation to climate smart agriculture, we start at that consumer level and we see that there's a demand for health and wellness. Then there's also the demand for planetary well-being, sustainability. And then you move up the supply chain to the distributors, retailers, brands, the groups that are engaging with consumers, and they have political and legal risk. They have branding and marketing needs to consumers. And then they have the de-risking of raw materials related to climate change, political risk. And so this is now putting a immense demand and pressure further up the supply chain from the farmers, the aggregators, the manufacturers, to create a new model of supply chain that is going to connect together the new practices towards climate smart agriculture that will satisfy the demands of their downstream buyers and the end consumers. So that's where it takes us today, is how do we drive that transformation to climate smart agriculture? I started with the market because the market drives everything within food systems, within sustainability. Market demands is what provides the incentives, the purchasing, the rewards, and ultimately this demand is what enables the financing. It enables the debt, the equity, the insurance, the ability for farmers, small scale, as well as mid-size and large scale, to transition into climate smart agriculture practices. Number one, there needs to be a demand. There needs to be a market commitment to say to the farming communities, to the manufacturers, that if you create products that have, for example, lower carbon, or have removed chemicals from supply chains, or are impacting farmers and farm workers and communities positively, there needs to be a market-driven demand for these qualities. So number one, there has to be the demand, and the demand has to be formalized and secured. So number one, we have to see that there is a market contract demand from leading retailers, leading brands, leading distributors. Otherwise, it falls on deaf ears, meaning that the producers are just listening to, hey, you need to switch your practices, which is you need to do a higher risk. You need to potentially lower your yields in the years towards transitioning to better practices. Yet there may not be a market demand. Yet there may not be higher prices or some type of incentive or protection or risk or debt or equity or infrastructure to make those changes. So what we're seeing is the need for a vertically collaborated model in which the commercial demand for sustainable products is providing contracted support and bringing in the governments for subsidies, the private sector banking for debt, the investment sector for equity, the insurance sector to de-risk these transitions to climate smart practices. And if we think we're going to leave it just to the farmers and the producers, the manufacturers, to take all this risk and all of these coordinated activities, you're dreaming. It's going to take a vertically collaborated solution where the market is directly engaging with their upstream suppliers in order to acquire these resources. And the resources become available because the market is guaranteeing that they're going to put 10 million, 100 million, $1 billion of purchasing power contracted to these new form of outputs. And so while we see this huge movement towards organic globally, and I know a lot less about the Turkish market, I know more about Turkish production, but as we look at the global market for, let's say, organic, which started in, the 1980s, became formalized in the 1990s. And while maybe we see bio or organic, it's only 1 to 2% of the global market, organic certified. So something isn't clicking. So while consumers say, we see evidence, 60 to 80% of consumers in Western markets say that sustainability is important to them. They say they would like to buy more organic. They say they want to have food systems that are transparent, that they know their source, and yet it's not being served. And we need to ask yourself, why is there such a demand from consumers, and yet it's not reaching the source of production? And we believe that there isn't enough collaboration and there isn't enough commitment across the public and private sector to engage directly with producers in order to change their practices. And so very specifically, what are the practices that need to be changed? Number one, inputs. What are going into the farms? If it's synthetic chemicals, that has a very high carbon footprint. And there are a lot of studies that show that this causes heightened levels of disease and cancer and other issues from the runoff and byproduct of these chemicals. Bad for biodiversity and ecosystem. It's bad for water, freshwater resources, bad for communities. So we have to take out as much as possible of these synthetic inputs into food systems. And when synthetic inputs are being used, they need to be used using models of precision agriculture, where you're minimizing the usage of these chemicals and you're applying them in very efficient and controlled ways to minimize the externalities and impacts. So number one, we need to go to the source, the producers, and get them into new inputs. Well, what can they replace the inputs with? There's a lot of solutions. And if you go to each country, Turkey as well, if you ask your grandma, or if you look at Turkish history, how were people using biopesticides, repellents locally prior to the advent of synthetic pesticides and synthetic herbicides? So we need to start looking at what are the locally produced products like garlic, like hot peppers, chili peppers. In the tropics, neem is another solution. And there's lots of them out there. And you can find that there's plant-based alternatives to use as biological pesticides. There's also ways to do ground cover and green manures and other cover cropping that will eliminate or reduce the need for herbicides. And there's ways to do on-site and regionally focused compost production, biochar production, and other biological fermentations where we're looking at a resilience model of a region, of a community, of a farm level program where the inputs of the fertilizers, the inputs of the pesticides, and the solutions to remove herbicides become a capacity building activity to train farmers and then provide them with the inputs and the resources and the programs and the de-risking to transition from a reliance on synthetic chemicals into more organic or naturally based inputs. And then from there, the other major issue here is once the programs of cultivating in a new model or the existing model are completed and the harvests happen, what we're finding all across the world in the United States and India and Africa, Latin America, and I imagine Turkey has a similar scenario, there is a lot of waste. So from the time it's harvested at a small farm and it gets brought to market, we find that it can lose anywhere between 30 and 70% of that total harvest. Number one, it's at the farm level. The market has been conditioned to have a model that is to have that perfect, elegant looking fruit and vegetable, right? And what we need to be doing is looking at the B grade, or the aesthetically less pleasing, the uglier harvest, and finding processing markets for those. So in Turkey, of course, they're famous for the apricots and figs. And as you know, 100% of those harvests can be used for dehydration. This is the model that we should be looking at for the other fruits and vegetables, and starting to look at, from a digital modeling, what is being harvested of each farmer, where are their centers of processing and packing, where are their logistics opportunities, and how do we connect in a digital marketplace between the farmers, the logistics providers, the post-harvest infrastructure, and then their access to market. And starting to look at intelligent digital frameworks and digital mapping activities so that we're able to minimize waste and ultimately increase revenues back to the farmers, because they can make more money on their harvests. And where there are missing infrastructures, this is the role of the private sector with the public sector to come together to make capital available so that logistics and post-harvest infrastructure can be financed and built around these farming communities so that they have a readily available market access point. And so as we look at this entire vertical, technology and data becomes the link. It's not a silver bullet. We're not going to solve all of these problems, or even most of the problems, with just some application or better data. The solutions are going to come from farmers changing practices. It's going to come from buyers committing to output that are sustainable. It's going to come from the government to subsidize and support farmers in their transition. It's going to come from the private sector to provide financing and insurance support. And it's going to come from the consumers to demand better products, greater transparency, greater traceability from their brands. This is what's going to drive the transformation to climate smart agriculture, climate smart food systems. However, data and technology is an incredible tool where we can become more intelligent. We can validate impacts so that those who actually do the better practices can do a MRV, measure, report, and verify, so that they can achieve carbon credits and make more money, so that we could validate that the products that do have a better social, ecological, health and wellness, nutrition impact, those can have a premium pricing on the market, and we can reward brands and farmers and manufacturers to be doing better practices. And data validation is a tool that our company is working with to validate information so that we can provide this incentive and this premium back to the source, so that we can reward the groups who are actually doing these practices, and that we'll know who is greenwashing or mismarketing or frauding the public by mislabeling and misrepresenting their products. And so we believe that the transformation to climate smart agriculture is going to be based on validated data, but ultimately it's going to be driven by people. It's going to be driven by farmers who make the change, by their downstream buyers who are supporting them and incentivizing them to do better practices, by the consumer who ultimately is driving this, and then by the public sector. So if there's any public sector people here from Turkey, we need to start looking at best practices that are happening in India, in Latin America, and Africa, where there are real incentives, real de-risking, and real monetary solutions. In the United States, multiple billions of dollars have just been put into grants to pioneer climate smart commodity transitions. There needs to be a robust movement from the government to give grants, de-risking on debt side, and real engagement in order to incentivize this transition. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that Turkey is an incredibly important country for the world's food security. Within Turkey, of course, there's a big opportunity for that market to be supplied by Turkish producers. But Turkey is known around the world for having world-class Mediterranean products. I mentioned apricots and I mentioned figs, but of course there's olive oil, there's sesame and tahini, and there's such a wide range of frozen fruits and vegetables and other processed products that are shipped out to the world. I believe that Turkey is uniquely positioned to be a sustainable supplier of food and food products to the European market, to the US market, to the Asian market, and to all global markets. And Turkey has both the history of agriculture as well as the human labor to go and do this. And of course, with the climates, the water, and the resources and soil of Turkey, there's an opportunity to be a global leader in this movement and ultimately create a robust multi-hundred billion-dollar industry around the agriculture and food system, supplying the world with more sustainable products. So thank you all for listening. Please reach me at keith@producerstrust.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions offline. Appreciate you having me today.